Welcome to the second half of our lecture, looking at Texas, the 15-year period from its statehood in 1846 until the outbreak of the Civil War. In this, the second part, we'll look at the Texas economy that wasn't directly related to slavery, and we'll also look a bit at the society of Texas. And finally, we'll look at some of the major political developments during this 15-year period. Now, we've already seen in part one the fact that there was extensive slavery in Texas, which should be really considered for our purposes part of the South, a southern state. But there were some Anglo-Texans who developed very large cattle ranches. There were others who focused on agriculture apart from cotton. Most of the significant agricultural production was cotton. But there was improved acreage, more acreage put under cultivation. And this was, we already saw in cotton, but this also occurred in the case of corn. Now, in looking at the infrastructure of the Texas economy during this period, the transportation network, manufacturing, and the growth of cities or urbanization were far behind the rates in the northern part of the country. And reflective of this is, even though there were massive cotton fields throughout the eastern half of the state, and there were large forests, the state imported all its cotton cloth and paper because there was simply there were no manufacturing facilities to turn the wood in the forest to paper or the raw cotton into cotton cloth. The transportation infrastructure was rudimentary at best. There were steamships on the larger rivers, such as the Brazos, Colorado, and some others, but it was not fully developed because the rivers themselves were very difficult for steamboats because the water was often too low, and then the sandbars would move constantly, and so the steamboats would run ashore. There was a very, very limited train network. It started near Houston in the late 1850s and ran in a northwest direction only about 70 or 80 miles. So it's nothing like the rail network in the northern part of the United States. And this, by the way, of course, is the same in the rest of the South. There were very few trains, and there were steamboats on the Mississippi River, but there was not much exploitation of other rivers. Compared to the north, there were virtually no canals constructed, and so the transportation network was pretty bad. And so basically the way people would get crops to, like cotton, they'd float it down the Brazos, Colorado rivers and some others, and then they'd be exported, well, not exported, but transported to New Orleans, where they get on large ships and be transported to the north or Europe. And as a result, the mail system was very, very slow and inefficient. The movement of cotton and other freight was very slow and very, very expensive. And for passengers, although there were some stagecoach lines set up, it was very, very rudimentary system for moving passengers around, and very expensive. And in the 1850s, as I mentioned a moment ago, the first railroad went from near Houston and went in a northwesterly direction. This is the first locomotive used in Texas. It was known as the General Sherman, and again, it didn't have much track to travel on. Texas essentially had no manufacturing. less than 1% of the labor force was employed in manufacturing. There was only a hat factory in Houston, one textile mill in the eastern part of the state, and there was some very, very limited manufacturing, local processing in some small towns and villages, but it was essentially no manufacturing. Again, this is typical of the entire South before the Civil War, and as we see when we move to the Civil War, this will be a major disadvantage for the South, the Confederacy, in fighting a long, protracted war with the North, where 99% of the ammunition in the country is produced in the North, etc., etc. In terms of geographic distribution, Texas was almost exclusively rural, with people living on farms or very small towns and villages. The largest city in the state in 1860 was San Antonio, with only 8,000 people. Galveston had 7,000 people, and Galveston had so many people because Galveston, not Houston, was the major seaport for Texas. And we'll see later that all changed after a major hurricane in Galveston around 1900. Houston had 5,000 people, and Austin and Marshall in East Texas had even fewer people. Dallas, which of course now is a huge city with many millions of people, had fewer than 500 people. Now, Texas, like the rest of the South, had great advantages in agriculture because of the geography, the warm weather, a longer growing season, and normally abundant rainfall, particularly in East Texas. But looking back on this period of time, the institution of slavery really, really retarded the development of Texas, like much of the South. Even though there were some wealthy land owners and slave owners making a lot of money, the entire economy of Texas, as well as the rest of the South, suffered greatly from the institution of slavery. In another respects, Texas was similar to the South. In Texans, like Southerners in general, really did not trust the banks, the banking system, or corporations. A corporation, of course, is a form of business. It's setting up a company with limited liability. Most Texans, and indeed most of the South, were Democrats who had strongly supported President Andrew Jackson's fight with the Second Bank of the United States. And also, virtually all Texans had blamed the Panic of 1837 with the economic recession. They blamed that on the state banks. So they essentially were against formal banking institutions. This attitude delayed the establishment of modern financial structures, which are essential for modernization, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. And indeed, the first state constitution adopted in 1845 prohibited banks in Texas, and it required corporations to attain legislative charters. So we've seen how the vast majority of the Anglos coming into the state came from southern states. Many brought slaves. Those who didn't brought the southern attitude towards slaveholding. They're very strongly in favor of slaveholding and southern cultural values. There was another large group that emigrated into Texas during this period of time, and these were Germans coming direct from Germany. They didn't stop, first of all, and live in New York or the Northeast for a period of time. The first Germans went to a land grant when Texas was still part of Mexico, and this land grant was near Austin and San Antonio, just north of Stephen F. Austin's large land grant. And so many Germans went to this area. And this was really encouraged by a book that was published in Germany by Detlef Dunt, who was a German immigrant to Texas. And he wrote this book, Journey to Texas, in 1833. I can't read German, but I've read the English translation of the book. And at one point, he describes Texas as, quote, a land which puts riches in the immigrants' laps, which can bring happiness to thousands and their descendants. And the book goes on and on about the abundance of land in Texas and the wealth of the land. And to put this in perspective, you got to remember, in Germany at this time, it was virtually impossible for anyone to obtain land unless their family had land. This was generally true in all of Western Europe. It was certainly true in France, in Britain, Spain, and elsewhere. And that, of course, was one of the driving forces for so many Europeans coming to the United States, where there was land, anyone could get land. And so his book was very popular in Germany, and many thousands of Germans emigrated to Texas. This map shows the dark area was called the German Belt. This was where the many thousands of early Germans first went in the late 1820s and the 1830s. Even more Germans came in 1844, just before Texas achieved its statehood. And this was driven by a society that was set up in Germany, and it was called Society for the Protection of German Immigrants to Texas. And it helped potential immigrants to Germany. It helped them, told them what to pack, where to go, how to, and really told people of the riches. And so this is very typical of European immigrants to the United States. Unlike the slaves from Africa, who were clearly forced to go as slaves, these people went willingly, and the vast majority of them wrote letters back to their families and friends and said, this is wonderful in the United States, and that's why we had so many immigrants come over. Not just to Texas, but in general to the United States. And this organization for the protection of German immigrants, the first agent was Prince Karl of Solms-Braunfels, and he obtained large blocks of land from the Republic of Texas. 1844, of course, Texas is an independent country, and very eager to have more Anglo immigration, and he obtained large blocks of land in the Austin, San Antonio area. And of course, there's a town just north of San Antonio called New Braunfels, which was named after him. If you haven't been in that area, next time you're in San Antonio or Austin, I encourage you to drive through cities such as Fredericksburg or New Braunfels, which have, to this very day, a very strong German influence. And in general, the German immigrants had a major cultural influence on the city of San Francisco, the surrounding area, and this was in language at the time, cuisine, architecture, dress, etc. And many of the small towns in that area have annual festivals, which are fascinating to go to, and you can, again, do it in a long day trip from Houston. Now, by the outbreak of the Civil War in 1860, there were about 20,000 Texans who had been born in Germany, a tremendous number. And these Germans were not politically active, but they really disliked the institution of slavery. And when, just before the Civil War started, and we'll see that more in the next lecture, they strongly opposed leaving the United States or secession from the United States, but they had no real political influence. This is a map of the today, they're not really entirely German settlements, but the areas of Texas that have great German cultural influence. And you can see it goes all the way from the Houston area, all the way. Heavy Green has more people of Germanic descent. It goes into San Antonio, Austin, and north. Now let's look briefly at the social structure of antebellum or pre-war Texas. And I just discussed in the first part of this lecture this relatively small group of landowners that had a large number of slaves. They were very politically powerful. They represented about 15% of the population, but they owned roughly 75% of all property. And that property would, of course, include their massive investments in slaves. In contrast, the earliest settlers lived in simple log homes, but as they moved into the middle class, they would often build homes of brick or frame, wooden homes. In the cities, which again are relatively small, the professionals there, these would be lawyers, school teachers, and others, they really competed in conspicuous consumption with the planters, and they often built, Greek Revival mansions and very wealthy, opulent two-story frame houses. I mean, these weren't your run-of-the-mill school teachers. These were people, particularly lawyers, and some doctors. In Galveston, you can still see some of these homes, and these were people engaged in the shipping industry, which was centered in Galveston. These upper-class homes were fashionably furnished with imported products from Europe, particularly France and Britain, the furniture, the mirrors, pianos, and very expensive and fine china and silverware. And why did they have so many pianos? Well, obviously at this time there was no television, there was no radio to listen to music, nor did they have the phonograph yet before the Civil War. So if you wanted to have live music, the only way to have live music was to have someone play the piano. And in the larger homes, if you have a tour, they'll often point out the music room. And this was a room that was set aside, and depending on the wealth of the homeowners, a number of times every year, they would invite in small orchestras who would play for their guests. And it was a lot of ostentatious consumption. Again, it was most fashionable to have imports directly from Paris. And virtually everyone was consumed essentially meat and corn. They had pork, beef, corn, very, very little wheat, even the upper middle class or the wealthy, because wheat was so expensive. When it was available in season, they would eat fresh vegetables, largely sweet potatoes and beans, but sometimes they'd have peas and lettuce and whatnot. But this is before really canned vegetables became available, and of course much before frozen vegetables became available. The kitchens were often in a separate building, and that was to reduce the risk of fire to the entire house if, as sometimes happened, the kitchen caught on fire. Or in the less wealthy homes where they had the fireplace for heating, they would simply use that to cook, and they put pots in over open fires. In terms of clothing, the wealthy Texans purchased ready-to-wear garments from cities like New Orleans and did their best to keep up with the latest fashions, primarily from New Orleans or Charleston, South Carolina, because they were Southerners. They They were more interested in the Southern fashions than what was happening in New York, Philadelphia, or Boston. Now, ready-to-wear garments means they didn't have to make them at home, or for elegant gowns, whatnot, the ladies would often have someone come in to measure them and produce the gowns. But they would usually do that by going to a major city like New Orleans at the time. Now, the middle class was very large in Texas. It's about 60% of the population in the 1850s. That's over half the population. And they owned about a quarter of all the wealth. And here we're talking about the middle class, obviously, of the whites. Now, the slaves clearly had less potential for a social life, but they did among themselves. With music, many slaveholders actually encouraged their slaves to go to church, where the Southern ministers, these were Protestant ministers, would explain to the slaves their biblical duty to be obedient to their masters. And this produced a real split between these Southern Protestants and the Northern Protestants. A good example of that is in the Methodist Church. In the northern part of the United States, the Methodist Church was perhaps the most active of all the Protestant denominations in denouncing slavery, and many of the members were abolitionists who not only wanted to limit the spread of slavery, but to abolish slavery. Well, obviously, those in the Northern Methodist Church were not pleased when the Methodists in the South preached to the slaves their duty to be slaves, to be loyal to their masters, and never said anything against slavery. And there was a split before the Civil War in the Methodist Church and a number of other Protestant denominations. And for that reason, for instance, in the Dallas area, you have the excellent university SMU, Southern Methodist University, because it was Southern Methodist. Now, obviously, Southern Methodists today do not support slavery, but that's where the name Southern Methodist came. And again, it happened in all the Protestant denominations. There were relatively few Jews in the South, or indeed in the North at this time, and very few Catholics. So that real split didn't take place except among the Protestants. Now, I encourage you to read a couple of pages in the textbook about the social life of slaves. It's an excellent description, and I don't want to spend 10 minutes just repeating essentially what is there. And you may be wondering when you read it, well, where did they get this information? Well, the information was obtained largely after the Civil War, when during the Reconstruction period, which we'll look at later, the South was controlled by the Northern Army and the North, and they brought researchers down, U.S. government researchers from the North, to interview the former slaves in Texas and throughout the South. And you can actually, I don't know if it's available online, but I remember in graduate school actually reading these books. And you could see the interviews with slaves, people who'd been slaves 10 years before would talk about their life, and one major element of that was the social life. So again, the textbook has several pages with an excellent description of the social life among slaves. And let's turn the last few minutes here to the political situation in Texas in the 15 years after statehood was achieved and before Texas left the United States to join the Confederacy. Looking at the state as a whole and comparing Texas to the rest of the United States, Texas had very broad democratic political rights for all free whites and Tejano men. So there were no such rights for the slaves. Clearly they could not vote, and no women could vote at this time, as was the case in virtually all states within the United States. And you did not have to, a white man did not have to own land to vote in Texas. In many states in the United States, both North and South, white men could not vote until the 1820s, 1830s, unless they owned property. And that continued actually in a few northern states until the 1850s. And these are white men. They couldn't vote unless they owned property. The assumption being only people with a stake in society should be allowed to vote and elect the representatives who make decisions. But right away, Texas, as soon as it became independent, allowed all white men to vote. Now, not surprisingly, the politics in the state was really dominated by the wealthy economic elites, and these were people who owned a lot of land. And of course, most of those large landowners had extensive holdings of slaves. It's interesting, you look at 1860, about 1/4 of the households in the state possessed slaves, but slaveholders were 2/3 of the politicians in local positions and state positions. So you had a disproportionate number of slaveholders in political positions. Again, this is typical in the rest of the South in the United States because Texas was in so many ways a southern state. And the slaveholders who are politicians in Texas agreed 100% with the Southern consensus that slavery was what they called their, quote, peculiar institution, and that Northerners had no right to criticize it because they didn't even know what it was, they didn't understand it. The Southerners argued right up until the Civil War that they treated their slaves much better than Northern factory workers treated their workers. And the example they'd often give is, well, when a worker in a factory in the North is injured on the job or becomes too elderly to work, they're just thrown out. But the Southerners would say, but here in the South, we take care of them. We give them food and housing in their old age or after they're injured. So there was essentially no criticism of slavery among politicians in the South. It was simply accepted. And there was great distrust of the central or federal government. And to some extent, this continues to the current day throughout the South, including Texas. We'll talk about that more in the course. And Texas was a one-party Democratic state. And it remained this way until the 1960s, 1970s. Actually, a little longer. We'll talk about that throughout the course. So it's a one-party Democratic state, as is the rest of the South. The South is Democratic. The Democratic Party is the what today we would call a very racist party. And the issue of succession or leaving the United States became really divisive in the South when the Republican Party was formed in the 1850s, the Republican Party. This is the same Republican Party as today and the same Democratic Party as today. The Republican Party was started, and it was in general against slavery, and particularly against the expansion of slavery. And so we have from this period all the way through the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s. We have the South solidly Democratic. We have in the South, not in Texas, but other states, Democratic governors standing in the doorway of elementary schools saying no black kindergarten girl will come in this school unless it's over my dead body. And of course, we'll talk about it later. President Eisenhower sent down federal troops and the governor quickly moved. So, but at this period of time, the issue was not civil rights. The issue was whether to stay in the United States or not. There were some in Texas who said, well, maybe instead of leaving the United States to join the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy, which was set up as an independent country, maybe we should just go back and be our own independent country. After all, Texas was the Republic of Texas for about a decade, but we don't want anything to do with this new government controlled by Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican. Now, throughout the period of the 1950s, Sam Houston really wanted moderation and voiced support for maintaining the Union. He was strongly against Texas leaving the United States, and we'll see in the next lecture how he spoke out about that, and he lost his job as governor. Now, Sam Houston was opposed by anti-slavery Northerners because Sam Houston owned slaves. He was a slaveholder. And Southern nationalists rejected his position because more and more they came to feel the only way we can protect our peculiar institution, or slavery, is by leaving the United States of America. We talked earlier about the U.S. annexing California. California became a state in 1850. And the question from then until the Civil War was, the national political issue in the United States was slavery. Should slavery expand? No one really in the North, no politicians in the North were talking about abolishing slavery immediately in the South where it already existed. Rather, the issue was the expansion of slavery into new areas. And, of course, Texas came in as a slave state. And in the, we'll talk about it in a minute, we had the Kansas-Nebraska mini Civil War. Now, at the same time, Texas, you recall, had was a huge entity when it came as a state. It claimed lands in eastern New Mexico, up to and including Santa Fe, and lands that went up into the current states of Colorado. And it really, really wanted more land in eastern Texas, and it didn't really have the national government acknowledge that. So in 1850, what happened is, you recall, in 1848, gold was discovered in Northern California. It led to the gold rush in 1849, the following spring. And so many people moved into California, the territory had enough people to become a state. A petition was sent around. It had enough signatures. It had to have 50,000 signatures. It was sent to Congress, and they said, we would like, in California, to move from being a territory to being a state, and we would like to be a free state. In other words, slavery would be prohibited in California. Well, when this happened, before Congress voted, the South was outraged and said, no, that's a huge area of land. It hasn't thoroughly been explored. There well may be a potential for large slave plantations. And at this point, in 1850, some of the southern states threatened they would leave the United States if California was admitted as a free state. Well, politicians in Congress argued and came up with the famous Compromise of 1850. So what this sought to do was achieve a balance between the North and the South, and what to do in the West. So California was admitted as a free state. The modern boundaries of Texas and New Mexico were set by Congress. And in return for losing land, Texas was given $10 million by the federal government, which Texas desperately needed because it had significant debts. The future of slavery in some of the other new territories obtained at the end of the Mexican-American War were left to be determined by the inhabitants of those states. And these are places like Utah and Nevada, Arizona, which were far too arid for cotton production. And a key element of the Compromise of 1850, which the South liked, was the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. And this was detested in the North, because what it said was Northerners had a legal obligation to return escaped slaves to their owners, and they could be prosecuted if they didn't do so. So as of any compromise, it was a balance between the two positions. Neither the North nor the South liked it. They were willing to live with it, but the net result was it increased tension between the North and the South. Okay, this is a map of what I just described, the Compromise of 1850. We look at Texas. What we see in green is the current shape of Texas. And to the northeast, what we see in dark brown is area that Texas gave up in the Compromise of 1850 in return for $10 million, which it needed. Just an interesting side note, the 1850 Compromise also banned slave trading, but not slavery itself in Washington, D.C. Now, this was favored by the northern states because they said, how can the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C. have major slave markets? So slave trading was outlawed, but not slavery itself in Washington, D.C. Well, a couple years before 1850, the state of Virginia, which had given land to establish Washington, D.C. in 1800, came out and said, no, we want our land back. And they had that right. And so they took back the Virginia portion of Washington, D.C., since the port of Alexandria was a major slave trading port. This is a map of Washington, D.C. from 1800 until 1848. And you can see Washington, D.C., this was set out. It's 10 miles on each side. It's sort of a diamond, a square tilted. And you can see the Potomac River running up. Just north of the Potomac River, you have the Capitol, the White House, etc. And when the District of Columbia was set up, no one was really living in this area. It was the wilderness. The part south of the Potomac River, south and west, was given by the state of Virginia, but under the terms that they could get it back if it wanted. The part north of the Potomac River, north and east, was given by the state of Delaware. And again, this was part of the compromise in drafting the Constitution, and nobody lived there. It was no real importance. But after 1800, the port of Alexandria, which I've circled in red there, it was located in Virginia, was a major slave trading area. Boats would arrive with slaves from Africa or slaves from other parts of the U.S., and they'd trade them there. So Virginia heard that, well, they might lose that right. So the state of Virginia told the federal government, we are exercising our rights, and we're taking back that portion of the District of Columbia south of the Potomac River. Well, this explains why Washington, D.C. has such a strange shape today. This is a modern map. This shows Washington, D.C. in orange, and you can see the Potomac River is at the eastern boundary, and across the Potomac River is the state of Virginia. Originally, it was a diamond, okay? Now, just a few more slides left. Sam Houston and the congressional delegation from Texas supported the 1850 Compromise. Neither side, North or South, liked it, but they realized that they weren't going to go to war. they had to compromise. And then for the next few years, Texas politicians stopped focusing so much on the slavery issue, and they tried to promote railroads and particularly education in the state. Well, in the mid-1850s, you had the famous Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was an attempt to find a compromise in the Congress over the extension of slavery. What happened was in the Louisiana Purchase area, which was owned by the federal government, there were two potential states, one Kansas, one Nebraska. They were territories, and both of them applied to be states. And they were allowed to have a vote among inhabitants whether they're going to have slavery or not. And people in favor of slavery moved in to Kansas. People opposed to slavery moved in. They took their guns with them. And they literally had a mini civil war in which many people were killed. Hundreds of people were killed because of the feelings were so strong. And Sam Houston was the only Democratic senator from the South to vote against this act, which permitted slavery's expansion into the West. And for this, he was hated by all the Southern nationalists in Texas and throughout the southern part of the United States. Well, Houston was, many people in Texas demanded that Sam Houston resign and leave the Senate. And he said, no, I was appointed. At that time, you remember that U.S. senators were not directly elected. They were appointed by the state legislatures. So he stayed in the Senate, but was really, really hated by many Texans. Well, he completed his time in the Senate, and a few years later, passions had cooled over this, and he successfully ran and became elected governor in 1859. And we'll see in the next lecture that when the following year, the Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president, Sam Houston as governor strongly opposed Texas leaving the United States to join the Confederate States of America. And he said he couldn't in good conscience serve as governor with the state leaving, and he resigned. And we'll talk about that in more detail in the next lecture. Thank you very much.